Thank you. Awesome. Cool. Can everyone see my VS Code? Cool. So we're going to look at Django. I just want to, where's my demos and notes repo? That's okay. I'll just do it in. I'll just do it in here. I apologize. I'm in the wrong spot. So, see, this is going to be simplest. Django. Awesome. So, Django is, well, what is Django? Can someone maybe give me like a real quick rundown on what they're familiar with it? Yeah, the D is silent. I'm working on it. I'm working on it. So, okay, that's what we know. Got it. Awesome. Yeah. Okay, that's great. The D is silent. That's what we know. I love it. Django is a web framework, and we had this question about frameworks versus libraries, and I think the big thing, like a framework gives you a skeleton, and we've seen a little bit about building the front end of a page with HTML and CSS, and now we're going to see how we build the back end, the part that actually runs a little web server application that serves up the HTML to our browser and can also receive data from it. You know, and a web framework is just a tool that helps you build websites or web apps. And if you only have to make a page or two, you don't necessarily need a framework. But if you're making the New York Times website, then you need a lot of pages, and you can't just hand write every single page. You've got to have some way to write code to kind of generate pages for you with templates and stuff. And a web framework does a lot of that work for you. It generates HTML pages, it talks to a database, it gives you a common structure for everyone on the team to align on. And every language that's used for web stuff has a framework. Python has Django, PHP has Laravel, PHP has more than one, Python has more than one. Ruby has Ruby on Rails, which is sort of the grandparent of all these frameworks. I think it was kind of the first one, and it set a lot of the conventions. And JavaScript and Node.js have 1,000, which is just terrible. And pretty much every language you can find someone's written like a web framework for it. So we're going to get started with this. And one of the things that we're going to get started with before we even get to the framework is the Python virtual environment. Has anyone messed with the Python virtual environment much yet?
So to be clear, Django is specifically for Python. It's not for JavaScript or anything like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, good question.
And if you were to bullet point it, you just said it's a back-end web framework?
Yep.
Okay.
You do front end stuff with Django too, because you can do a lot of HTML templating, but because it's written in Python and because of the way it's designed, all of the code for our Django web framework is running on the server. We're going to generate HTML and send that to the browser, but all that work gets done on the server. And that's the big difference between like a web framework like Django, or when we start to see things like React with JavaScript and things like that, where there's like a lot of JavaScript code getting executed in the browser. Yeah, that's a really good question, Alicia. What other questions do people have about Django actually before we talk about virtual environments?
You mentioned it talks to a database. Can you tell me what you meant by that?
Yeah, totally. Have we done anything with SQL and databases?
Not
yet.
SQL, at least. I don't know about anything else.
Got it. Yeah, so we're just going to touch on that in a nutshell for right now, and we'll see that coming up real soon. In essence, your database is another program running server side, either on the same computer that our Django framework is running on, or maybe on another server computer, and they're talking to each other over a network. And to take the New York Times as an example, you know, user account information is going to be stored in the database. And maybe if I'm a reporter, when I write my article, I write it in some editor program and I save it, and the text of the article itself goes in a database. And we'll see what a framework like Django can do is pull that data from the database. So like pull the text of the news article out, shove it in a template, build some HTML for it, and serve that page up. And we're not going to look at that today, but that's kind of where it's going. Did that make sense? A little bit of sense.
So is it kind of like an API then? Is it like pretty similar?
Great question. We can use Django to build an API, or do something, yes, that does very similar work.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. And Raphael, did that, I'm not sure if I did the best job of explaining that. I'm curious if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think you hit all the important points. Let's, you know, in a nutshell, what a back-end web framework does. I don't know what more we can say in 2 minutes.
Yeah, agreed. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and now that we're getting on to the back end and that we're going to start building projects, we have to start caring more about our project structure and managing dependencies and organizing stuff. And that's where Python's virtual environment comes in. Pretty much every language has different tools for managing libraries that you have to install, managing dependencies. What's a dependency, by the way? Anyone have a quick?
The other programs that the program you're using depend on to work.
Yeah, exactly. Managing dependencies and things like that. And Python has an approach called a virtual environment. It also helps us manage different versions of the Python language. As many of you folks know, Python is on version 3 now. I think I'm running 3.9 on my computer. For anyone who's curious, if you do Python -- version in the command line, you'll see your version of Python. If you're curious, there's also a command line tool which will show you where that Python executable actually lives. And I actually have, it looks like it's pointing to a Python environment right now, because I was running a Python environment earlier and I may have to kill it or something.
Yeah, I just want to add a quick note real quick, just about the which command.
Yeah.
Which is, useful oftentimes, but I think it gets confused in situations involving aliases. So, and particularly for us here, if we have, Python is in installed referring to Python 2, then we also alias Python to Python 3, the which command might not give you the correct information. So instead, I recommend people do type Python, and that's a little bit smarter. And that can tell you if you have an alias that's referring to something else, or if that's the actual name of the binary.
That's a good call. Thank you.
Mhm.
I'm not that familiar with the command line utility type, so that's good for me to learn.
Yep, I learned that one pretty recently, just as I'm like grappling with these issues with aliases in Python.
Yep. Yep. And I have something going on with my Python because yesterday in a different directory, I started a Python virtual environment when doing some lesson prep. And I'm a little surprised that it's pointing to there still, but I think it'll be fine. So, and yeah, and this actually touches a bit more on, let's see here. Let's see if well, let me talk a bit more about virtual environments and then I'll see if I can fix this. So a virtual environment helps us with all these issues. If I have multiple projects, maybe one project needs Python version 3.3. Maybe one project needs version 2 of Django and another project needs version 4 of Django. So a virtual environment bundles everything in the virtual environment up. So when we're starting a new Django project, or lots of, not necessarily just with Django in Python, like a new project, we're going to create a virtual environment. And what the virtual environment does is it kind of creates a fake file system. I guess it's not fake, but it uses some tools so that we sort of have a virtual file system that Python interacts with when it gets the Python language and dependencies. And I believe it actually also copies over and installs the Python language itself inside our virtual environment, or at least makes it appear that way. So the idea is whatever you do in one virtual environment doesn't affect anything else. On a high level, does that make sense to folks? And do folks have any questions about that? Cool. And when we use a virtual environment, it affects our path variable, which is this core sort of terminal shell concept. And this is the variable that has the directory path to like everything we might want to run from the command line. We kind of need to have where those things live in our path. And there's all this junk here. There's a lot of Ruby stuff, as you can see here. Like, it looks like most of my path is saying where Ruby is. There's a lot of stuff in my path that's probably not needed. The directory that a lot of stuff points to is a directory called user/bin. And that's kind of like a Linux. So this might be a little different on Windows convention. For where to put all sorts of executables. And in fact, that should be where Python lives. And so that's where my Python, some of my Pythons are installed. All of them, I think. Cool, so this is a lot of talking. Let me go ahead and create a new virtual environment. And there's a tool called VENV, Virtual Environment, that we use to do this. It should be installed when you installed Python and pip, the Python kind of module management installation tool. I'm curious, excuse me. Yeah, so VENV is installed with Python. It's not its own separate executable. And we have to add this command line flag -m. And I'm actually, not 100% sure what that does.
The dash M stands for module in this case. So if you want to use Python not to like run some other file, but to invoke some built-in module, you can use the -m flag.
Ah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Raphael. Cool. Yeah, so what we're doing here is we're using the venv module to create a new virtual environment. I'm going to name it Simplest Django. And with luck, this will run and work successfully and won't complain about anything else. And it did. And let's see what has changed. So it's done a lot of work for me. It's created a directory called Simplest Django. And if we go in there, we can see it's done a couple things. It's created some directories. Bin. So this is a common convention. We were talking about that directory /user/bin. Bin, I believe, is short for binary, as in like a program that's ready to run. Like if you looked at it in a text editor, it would look like assembly code because the operating system can read it and run it. And Python does this too. And this is where it actually installs Python, the Python language, and pip, the Python package installer, and some scripts that we're going to use. And this way, everything is self-contained in our virtual environment. And we have this lib directory, which I assume is, I believe, where modules go. And there's nothing in this include directory in the moment. That may be when we install things where things go. And then we have this pyvenv.cfg, which I'm pretty sure is short for config. And can everyone see this okay, by the way? And does it work when I'm kind of printing stuff out on the console this way to talk about stuff?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So in here, we can see it's pointing to where Python lives. I don't know a ton about what is going on here, and we're not going to have to edit it. The main thing is I just want to show you folks that this stuff exists and that none of it is magic, even though it has a lot of steps. And in fact, the next step we're going to do is in that bin directory is a shell script called activate. And that I'm going to open up so we can look at it. And this is all created for us when we create a new Python virtual environment. So this is a shell script, which is meant to be run in like Bash or ZSH. And we don't have to understand what all this does. We can kind of see what's going on here. It's taking that system path variable and it's assigning it to maybe some new system variables that it creates. It's setting up our virtual environment. And what's great is at the top of it are some comments that tell us how to run it and that we're not supposed to run it directly. I'm curious, there's two of these. Yep. It looks like there's two versions of the same thing, just maybe with slight differences for different shells or something like that.
Yeah, the default one is for Bash, I believe. But if you're using some non-default shell, like CSH or ZSH, then they have alternative scripts for you folks. Although honestly, I've seen people using ZSH that just ran the default script anyway, and it seemed to work fine for them. So I don't know.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know enough about the Bash CSH differences.
They're very similar.
Yeah. Yeah, and all these shells, I think it's like POSIX, which is some standard for shells. So we've created our virtual environment, and now we're going to activate it. And this is all, these instructions are in the curriculum. So that's, I think, the good reference to go to.
So real quick to interrupt, like,
Yeah, not at all.
are you only going, so you're going to create this virtual environment if you know that whatever project you're going to be working on has a different Python version than yours, or what kind of says, oh, I need to do this thing?
That's a really good question. Raphael, tell me if I'm wrong. My gut says if you're doing anything where you're going to be installing dependencies from the internet, like Django or something else, then you probably want to create a Python virtual environment for your project.
Absolutely. You should never install dependencies outside of a Python virtual environment. You don't
For
really want
those of
anything
us who could
over-installed.
not peg, for those of us who could not throw a dart at a dependency,
Right,
then how would we know? Like,
right.
not to sound like
Right.
an idiot,
No,
but I
not
would be
at all.
like, oh, that thing right there is a dependency. I'm about to use this, so let me use this.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And we're going to get there in a minute. Basically, we're going to run this command called pip, which I think probably stands for like Python install package. And that's the tool we use to install other libraries of Python code from the internet. Like there is a server somewhere that's the standard Python server. I know there's a website too that lists all the modules. With Node, it's called NPM.
So like, because when you say dependency and libraries and modules and stuff, the only experience I have so far is like, oh, I have to install random or import random
Right.
before I use math.random, but I have a
Right.
feeling that's not what you're referring to.
Well, you're halfway there. Like you're totally right that what you're importing and using a module when you do import random. The difference is that imagine that random wasn't bundled with the Python language when it was installed, but we still want to use it. And the way that has developed thankfully for modern programming languages is that there are tools called package managers that we can use to install stuff. And we're going to see that coming up. Pretty much that's the next step. But this site is actually really good to see. And I'll throw it in Slack. And it's good to see where this stuff lives too. So pip is a tool for installing Python packages. And if you hear package, dependency, library, honestly, they're all sort of interchangeable terms. Especially at this point, I know it can feel a lot. I think the best advice I can give is they're basically interchangeable terms. And what matters is if you have to install it from the internet or not. Like, for instance, random is a good example. Like, random isn't a dependency for our project because that module gets installed with the Python language, right? So whenever we have Python, we know that random is there. So we don't have to like say you need random. You know, if I was looking at a class, like if I had a class that used random and I was moving it from one file to another, I would say, yeah, this class has this dependency random, and I have to make sure I copy and paste that import statement as well. With virtual environments, it's really like once you start installing other modules or libraries from the internet, that's when you want a Python virtual environment. And as soon as you start building larger applications where you have like lots of files and structure, that's when you want a virtual environment. And that's why we haven't really used them thus far, because we haven't needed them. Does that help a bit, Alicia?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry.
That's a really, really good question. Really good question. And I'm sure other folks are wondering the same thing. Any other questions related to that?
I have a quick question. So when I was following along with the virtual environment creation and all that,
Mhm.
And when you went into your bin folder, it had like 6 or 7 different files in it. But on my
Mhm.
computer, it only has 3, and there's like Python, Python 3, and Python 3.10. When I try opening it, it says that it can't because it's like either displayed in binary or uses some other kind of text encoding. But I didn't have that like activate file or anything. I just have like those 3 Python files.
You should have those activate directories there. And what I would say is let's circle back to that after the lecture. Because if it's not, then it may be something with your setup, or maybe I moved over a step a little too quick for the lesson, and there's just something that we need to do. With regards to, Python in the bin directory not being able to be opened in a text editor, that's exactly correct, because that's an executable file. That's assembly code or something like that, and it's not meant, like, you could open it in a text editor, but it wouldn't make sense. It's not human readable, and it's not meant to be. It's for the computer to run.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And please ping me after the lecture so I don't forget to follow up with you about making sure that your virtual environment is set up. And try the next step that we're going to do too, and let me know if it works or not. Any other questions? Nathan, to answer your question, yeah, libraries are basically collections of modules. I mean, in Python, a module has a slightly more specific meaning because it's like an individual thing that it's a namespace, right, that you can import and export. And library is sort of a catch-all term. With this PyPy site with pip, what I more want to point out is, like, this is where, when we're going to be installing stuff from the internet, like, this is the phone book. This is the phone book that has the address of where the server that has the actual Django library and all the modules associated with it live. So when we use pip on the command line, I'm not sure if it's going to pypy.org or if they have a different server, but this is how that works. There's like the central phone book that has the addresses of where to grab all these modules. And on that vein, I want to continue on and activate the virtual environment and install some dependencies. So I created my virtual environment and I want to activate it. And I've moved outside of that simplest Django directory. I mean, I guess I don't really have to, but to run it, we use this command source, which is the command we use for certain shell scripts when we need to update our path variable and our shell environment. And we are going to tell our shell to read and execute that activate script. And something really cool has happened here, which is now my command prompt has changed, which indicates that I'm in the virtual environment. And nothing crazy has changed. Everything looks the same, but I'm inside the virtual environment. And when I use pip and the Python to run the language or install stuff, it's happening inside the virtual environment. And to exit the virtual environment, I just run this command deactivate, and my command line prompt changes back. So I'm gonna, and for those of you who don't know, on the command line, the up arrow or Control P and the down arrow will go through your command history, which is a super useful tool. So I'm activating my virtual environment. And now I want to install Django with this dependency management installation tool pip that we've been talking about. And this is going to talk to a server somewhere. And this is, I tested this out yesterday because I ran into this specific issue. And I wonder if the issue is VS Code my VS Code because I tested this in my terminal and it worked. I see. So to kind of repeat myself, now in my virtual environment, and I'm just using a terminal program called iTerm. And I may have to be inside the simplest Django directory too. That may have been a mistake I made. And Evan, the activate step will always do. You know, we'll only install Django if we need to. I do apologize, folks. You know, I thought I had resolved this. And now that I'm realizing this, I'm realizing I probably was using a different laptop and I totally goofed. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to take more than 5 minutes to see if I can fix this. And then if I can't, I can at least walk people through the rest of the lesson.
So Adam, were you connected to a virtual environment at the start of this lecture?
Yeah, I was wondering about that too. My Python was certainly pointing to one. Which I found a little confusing. Like, yeah, maybe I could use a little debugging help here, Raphael.
Yeah,
Let me
let's see.
deactivate. Let's see. So
it's pointing to a PyEnv environment. So that's a different environment manager, right?
yeah,
Do you know how to set that up, or you can deactivate that guy or just delete it? I don't know.
yeah, I think the deletion, that's a really good point. I think I used that the other day. Let's see here, simply remove from a shell. Okay. So I've got Python installed via Homebrew. I could just delete the pyenv directory to completely uninstall pyenv.
Well, I'm wondering if PyEnv changed your shell paths, you might have to do it the proper way. Like deleting it might not leave you in a good state.
Yeah,
So I'm just looking online some pyenv commands. Can you do, I think it's pyenv local system or pyenv shell system or
Like this?
pyenv shell -- unset. Try that one, that sounds good. So now if you do, no. Pyenv shell system maybe. Seeing a few suggestions online. And then space system after that, I think that's a keyword.
Thank you.
And then, is this any different? No, what is going on here?
So I wonder if I might just delete that pym directory because I can't find, I'm looking at a Stack Overflow post and I can't find a reference to pym in in any of my shell script stuff. Let's see here. If we quit VS Code, and then if we quit terminal. And if this doesn't work, Raphael, maybe what we have to do is I need to get some help from yourself or Zainab in working through this. Because I'm realizing I used my other computer to go through some of this stuff, and that one has Python set up properly, or I wasn't running into these issues. So this is good. Deleting the pym got rid of that.
Okay. That's more what I'm expecting to see here. So let's try this again from the top.
So while you're getting back to where you were at, I wanted to follow along here, but I'm back on the first step. It says MVENV, and then in brackets it says env name. Is that a filler for some name you're supposed to put in yourself, or are you supposed to actually type that?
Whatever, that is a filler. When you see brackets like that,
You just pick whatever. So it's just like a variable. You just pick whatever.
Yep, it's going to be the name of the directory and the name of your project, essentially. So like here, I just named mine Simplest Django.
Oh, okay. So that's, you're saying basically you're going to create a folder called by your project name, and that's where you're going to put all of this.
Exactly.
So okay. So my terminal should be, I should be in that folder when I want to create my virtual environment. Is that right?
I am inside one, but it doesn't have to be. That was just sort of an extra level of organization that I added. And actually, like what I want to do right now, I want to delete that. And like, so for instance, here in the curriculum directory, we could create a virtual environment. And I'm going to do that. And I have to use Python 3 because I don't have my Python set up to point to, I still have Python 2 installed and it's not quite right. So like if I run this now, it'll take a minute, but it's going to create a directory named Simplest Django, and inside there, our virtual environment will be set up. So you would just run it like whatever directory you're keeping all your projects in, like it might be in a projects directory that you do this. Did that make sense, Alicia?
Yes, thank you.
For sure. Yeah, this may be an issue with my Mac.
I know I've seen this before too. I don't remember what the resolution was.
Yeah, I think the resolution is installing Python with Homebrew. We might just have to do this now real quick.
Do we want to maybe take a short break right now? Come
Yeah.
back at 11?
Yeah, Raphael, thank you. That's a great call. let's do a short break, and I should have this sorted out.
Yeah, I think we're back
Thank you
here.
so much. Inside. Thank you, Raphael. Let's try pip. So just to step back and recap, actually.
Did you want to share your screen?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I totally meant to. So just to recap, I'm in the terminal. We created that Python environment, simplest Django. And now I'm going to activate it. And I'm going to go inside the directory for my project. And I'm going to use the command line tool pip to install the Django module. And let's see what happens. And I tried this just before we came back, and it did install. And this is telling me that hey, requirement already satisfied, Django and lib, Python 3.9 site packages. And this is actually nice because I was actually curious about this. It tells us where everything is living. And we're inside our project in the lib, the library directory. And the virtual environment does us the nice favor of kind of organizing things by the version of Python used, it looks like. And in here for Python version 3.9, which should be what I'm running, there's a directory named site packages. And that's where Django and some dependencies of Django have been installed. And normally I would I delete them and I'd run pip install again. But as I ran into some issues before, I don't want to tempt the computer gods. So we should be good to go. And Django is all set up. And let me go ahead and open Visual Studio Code.
Hey,
So
hey,
we
Adam,
can, yeah,
sorry to cut you off.
No.
A question about just opening the environment.
yeah.
Do you have to, does it matter, I guess, what directory you're sitting in when you activate an environment, or?
That is a great question. It doesn't matter what directory you're sitting in. You do have to be, I believe, no, you don't have to be in the project to deactivate it. And let me run that command again. So from the curriculum directory, I ran this source command, and then I need to point it to the activate script inside my project that I'm going to start up the virtual environment for. And so here, that's the simplest Django directory /bin/activate. But if I wanted to go inside that directory, I could do source bin activate, and I'm pointing to that same script, right? I'm just,
Okay.
yeah,
So I guess when you do the Python TACM virtual environment, then you give it a name, you're creating that environment in the directory you're in. Because it seems like, well, you're creating it in a subdirectory, I suppose.
say that
and
one more
then
time.
It seems like when you initiate an environment and you create one with Python TACM virtual environment and you give it a name, right? You're creating that environment from the directory you're sitting in. And then you have to point your source into that environment, and then you mess around inside there. Or does it? I guess I'm trying to understand how that exists on your computer. And when you deactivate it, does it simply go away? Are you just?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me recap that, and I'll start up another virtual environment so that we can see. Let me just save my notes. Oh, so I'm in the simplest Django here, so we can't see the full path. Are folks comfortable with directory paths from the command line? I know it's not as good as.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so in the curriculum directory, you are correct about virtual environments. Like if I want to create a new environment, Python-m venv my new environment. this command will create a directory named my new environment wherever I'm executing this command. Like I'm running this command in the curriculum directory, and so it's going to create this new directory, my new, let's call it my new project here.
So it appears as just a directory on your computer, but there's a virtual environment inside of that that is contained.
That's a really good question. So this -mvenv command, it does all the setup work to create a project with a virtual environment. But oh, I should actually. It does all the setup work, but it doesn't actually start the virtual environment, right? It's like the difference between writing a function and calling it. We've sort of written our virtual environment, but we're not starting it up. And you're correct that everything needed to start up that virtual environment lives in that new directory, because virtual environments are tools for managing different projects.
As a cyber professional, I just want to let you know that also a virtual environment is not the same as a virtual machine. So there's no OS isolation between virtual environments, like if you have a virtual machine.
Yeah, I don't want to open that door too much, because I know that a lot of folks might not be familiar with virtual machines. And you're right that they're totally different concepts. Totally different concepts. They share a little bit of, you know, they share a little bit of DNA, but a virtual machine is a whole nother ball of wax.
Which if you have a virtual environment that's insecure, then you can gain access to the entire operating system through that one environment.
That is true, but that's not also like I don't know a ton about Python virtual environments, but I'm pretty sure there's no concept of security, and it's not meant to be used in that way. And in that case, it's very different from a virtual machine. And the context here, like a virtual machine is a program that runs a complete situation of like a whole nother computer inside your computer and gives you a lot of isolation between memory and things like that, so that nothing, not nothing, but so that a lot of things cannot interact between the two. All our Python virtual environment does is really fake some file system stuff so that we can easily manage all the dependencies we need for our Python project. Yeah, and Zach, I apologize if I'm kind of oversimplifying and skipping over some things. It's more so just for the purposes of time. You're absolutely right that a Python virtual environment gives us no security guarantees whatsoever.
Which I guess the question is, so when you're moving to a production environment, you don't use virtual environments, right? For Python.
No, you probably would. You definitely would, because what we would use other things for security purposes. My understanding is really all we're using the virtual environment for is to manage our dependencies and which version of the Python language we're using. And then you would handle security by whatever you do with the computer, the machine that this code is running on, or if you run it inside a virtual machine or something like that. I think that's correct. I haven't worked with Python in production, but based with like other package managers, that's kind of my understanding. And I'm not 100% on that actually. So that is a good question. And let me get back to you about Python virtual environments in production.
So I guess my question is kind of like trying to figure out the line between creating the virtual environment, which, from a layman's perspective, just looks like a directory is being made. But
Right.
then when you step into that directory and activate the virtual environment, you can now do things with your project. I guess if I go and I go to a bunch of like 5 different directories and I activate virtual environments, or I create virtual environments for all of them, I have 5 directories that are tied to a virtual environment. And if I step into any one of them and activate that virtual environment, I can then play around with that project. Is that correct? I'm trying to.
Yeah, that's essentially correct. You would only be activating one virtual environment at a time, and you would be doing it for the project you want to do work on. And the reason is that guarantees that we're using the correct version of Python, and any other Python related command line tools, and that when we install Python modules, they're going where we expect them to, and are going to be the version that we desire.
So when you deactivate, does that environment exist still? And you
Raphael,
can reactivate it, or do you have to recreate it?
that's a really good question, and Raphael makes a really good correction to what I said in the chat. That essentially the virtual environment, running the source activate command doesn't create the virtual environment. It activates or enables it. What was could you say your question again, Justin?
I just want to understand those 3 commands, right? So
Right.
so Python tecm via env and then source and then deactivate. What exactly is happening when you do those, I guess is the bottom line for my question. It sounds to me like when you do the first line, tecm ve env, and then you give it a name, that creates a directory, does it not?
It does create a directory, absolutely.
Okay. And then
Like-
when you type source directory name and location bin activate, that's when you activate the environment for that directory.
Yeah, and
Okay.
and to walk through that again, when we run this command -m python -m vnv and the name of our project, it's going to create a new directory and a virtual environment for that directory. What did I miss? No module name. Oh, I have a typo. That's odd. I don't want to.
Using Python 2 or Python 3?
Yeah, let's try it. There we go.
Yeah, you didn't have your alias set up. That's right, you said that before.
Yeah, that's the system installed Python. Yeah, so Justin, you're totally correct that when we run that env command, it creates a new directory. And inside that directory, it creates a virtual environment. It sets up directories we need. It sets up the config file for that virtual environment. And it creates the shell script that we'll use to activate or enable that virtual environment. And you can kind of see the big thing that it does is it creates a variable for our shell that points to the directory that we're going to work in. It adds that to the path directory for the shell so that when we run Python related commands from the command line, it goes to our directory for our project and our virtual environment to find the language Python and to find those packages. And I think I'm not 100% on this. And after this, I do want to move on so we can dig a bit more, because the virtual environment, really at this point, you make it, you start it, you stop it, and we don't really have to use or do that much more with it. So I don't want to get too lost in the weeds. But this path variable for my shell system right now, it's got Python somewhere in here. And it says, hey, when someone runs the Python command, I go to this directory /user/local/share. And now let's say let's see, source activate project 3. Oh, I'm in project 3. Source activate bin activate. Spell it.
Just source bin/activate.
Thank you. We've enabled the virtual environment. And it looks like it hasn't. Let's see if it's changed. So something has happened to my path here. Let me clear this so that's not a mess. Again, I'm not 100% on what it does to this path variable, but I can almost guarantee you this path to this project 3/bin directory wasn't part of my shell path variable before I enabled the environment. And if we deactivate, and we look at the path again, nothing shows up. This is a filter command. So that's one of the core things that enabling or activating a virtual environment does, is it adds to our path for the whole shell so that everything Python related is being grabbed from our project, from our project's virtual environment. And on that note, I definitely want to move forward so we can see about writing some Django code. How are people doing? I know we got a little bit in the weeds here, so I just kind of want to pause and check in with folks. How are people feeling? Energy-wise, are we good to go on? Do we want to take like a 5-minute break? Maybe share some thoughts or some emojis? I see some thumbs up.
I think maybe it'll make more sense when we get into it and actually see how it's applied.
Yeah, agreed.
It seems very theoretical right now and difficult to understand without seeing the application.
Yeah, I agree with you, Maya. Yeah, totally. And I did get a little bit in the weeds here because all this virtual environment stuff is not stuff that we have to worry about too much right now. So moving forward. So for this simplest Django example, I am going to start up the virtual environment for it. And we have gone ahead and installed Django. And now let's start a new Django project. Let's start like kind of getting to the fun stuff. And for instance, the virtual environment helps us here so that we're using the Django that we installed. And here's this -m for module command again. And this is all we need to do to start a new Django project. And I lied. We do have to include a command here. Actually, this shows us all the different Django commands that we can run from the command line to do things to help us. And we want this start project command. So we're going to start a project, and I'm just going to call it school, because that's the example that we're working through. And you'll note that it created a new directory for us here.
Hey, Adam, would you mind opening up your Explorer so we can see these folders being made and everything?
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome, Alicia. Good call. So Django does a lot of setup for us. It creates this directory. And then it creates a lot of different Python files, most of which are config files, and that we're not going to mess with too much right now. Really, most of this stuff we don't have to worry about. So let's see here. So this is kind of like the last config step we need to do. And this is a good practice, is we do need to keep track of our project dependencies. And pip has a command called freeze. And that lists all the dependencies that we've installed that we require for our project. And this is a little command line tool called pipe. And I'm just going to pipe that output into a text file. And this is a standard Django thing. So like other Django programmers and like utilities make use of this. And now I have a text file with my project dependencies and their specific versions. So someone else could read and download, read and install this project with the correct dependencies. And I believe one of one of the files that we got for free with Django is a file called manage.py. And it gives us a couple commands. And one is it can run a little web server for us. And it's telling me all sorts of stuff that I'm going to ignore about warnings and things like that. The important thing is this message right here, starting development server at this IP address on my local host. And we can, in fact, check that out right now. And I've got a Django server running. Now, I'm not doing anything with it at the moment, but it's running, which is great. I refresh, the page refreshes. If I kill my web server, it doesn't work. Well, it grabbed a cache. There's some sort of caching going on there. Now
Yeah,
let's
it's a
start.
little awkward with the live Django server. It can sometimes look like your server is online when it's not because of the really aggressive caching. So yeah, check the command line.
Yeah, it's a good call. And in fact, no, I do have disable cache. Well, DevTools is open. So maybe because DevTools wasn't open. Let's take a look now at writing some code to do stuff with our Django program. Everyone feel good about this step of starting the Django project and starting up a Django server?
No.
Okay, what's on your mind, Maya?
I'm in my simplest Django environment. I have the parentheses over to the left. But can you go back through how you got to the, like how you started the project and got it into the server?
Yeah, 100%, because we've covered a lot of ground. First thing is to install the Django library, if we haven't, and to run that pip install Django command. I've already installed it, so I see this requirement already satisfied message. If you haven't installed it, you should see it doing some stuff, and it should install Django pretty quickly. And as long as I'm inside the simplest Django directory, then that command is good to run. After that, what I did was, I don't want to delete too much stuff. Well, let's see what the commands are here. Let's see if there's a delete. Yeah, I don't want to delete and rebuild my Django project just in case it screws something else up. But the command then, once we've installed Django, like the toolkit. So when we install Django, it's like, think of it as we now have a toolbox of tools. And then the first tool that we want to use is to set up like the skeleton of a Django project. And this is a bunch of command line stuff. We're telling Python, use this module called Django. For this Python module Django, run this command start project and create a project called school. And then I would hit enter if I hadn't done that already. And then that should create a directory named school. And then there's a bunch of things in there. And then someone mentioned it in the chat, and I think they're correct. We have to go inside that school directory. I'm pretty sure, pretty darn sure, to then start our Django server. Yeah, because we're using this file manage.py. And so here we're telling Python, run this file manage.py. If we look in it, and it's right here inside the school directory, we'll see it does a bunch of stuff. It's basically grabbing a lot from Django and letting Django do a lot of work. And we want it to run a web server. And we haven't put anything in there yet. We're just seeing the default Django sort of homepage. It should be. I wish I knew actually where. Raphael, do you know where this template file lives for the install worked successfully? Congratulations.
I'm not sure, honestly.
Yeah, it's a little surprising because there's not a lot here in the Django project. But that might be a little getting into the weeds. Maya, are those steps working for you?
Yes, they are. I got that same message that you got saying that there were some that were unmigrated.
Mhm.
I migrated them. Hopefully I didn't break my computer, but everything seems to be doing what you're doing so far.
Awesome. Yeah. And those unmigrated messages, you'll see stuff like that all the time. And there's actually a really good distinction to be made here. Like now that we're starting to like install dependencies and stuff, you folks are going to see all sorts of warnings. Warnings are fine. If you see like an error message, then it's an issue. But warnings, we can, if everything's doing what we want, we can ignore warnings for the time being. Cool. Alicia, I see that you ran into an issue with pip install Django, and I think the best thing at the moment might be I can share my screen and you folks can see how it works, and then after lunch we'll all be working through this process for the exercise, and then it'll be easier for us to help people individually then. Yeah, and it's only in the interest of time that I'm saying that.
So real quick, I'm totally cool just watching since I'm running into all these errors. I'm assuming, so I exited my VS Code and reopened it since it wasn't working. And then I just tried typing deactivate just to try and say, okay, now I'm done. And it's just saying command not found. Is it done or is it still open or?
If you type deactivate and see command not found, that probably means there is no virtual environment running right now.
Okay, so if you open a virtual environment and then you exit your VS Code, does that automatically closes it, I guess?
Yeah, I believe so, because the shell quits. I'm not 100, but I think so.
Okay.
So let me just add to that. When you activate a virtual environment, that only applies to that one terminal tab where you ran the activate command.
Yeah, that's
So
a
like-
really good essential point. Thank you. Yeah.
So that's why
Yeah,
it's
go on.
really important that activating the virtual environment changes your command prompt. So you can see which terminal tab has that active virtual environment.
Okay. So I guess a follow-up question then is, I still have this school project. Would I, let's say I was done working on it and I wanted to get back in, I recreate my virtual environment, re-download Django, and then just not create the project folder? And
You
just
would
from there?
re-enable or reactivate the virtual environment. If Django's installed, you shouldn't have to reinstall it. I do want to move on because I want to show us how to do some of this stuff. And this is really normal, by the way, especially when you're learning and it's new, or even when you're experienced and you started a new company. There's just a lot of config once you start getting into like real projects and dependencies and stuff. And there's a bunch of steps. Like a week from now, all this stuff will be second nature. Today, it's supposed to be a bit confusing. And that's also why I want to move on, because there are so many steps. It'll be way easier to help people and debug and get everyone in a good state when we can do it one-on-one. Okay, cool. And in that vein, we're going to look at just the basics of what to do with Django, really, and how to make some requests and stuff. And Alicia, thank you for being patient. Yeah, and unfortunately, debugging installation issues is about 50% of programming. And are there any other questions that folks have before I dive into this? I can't promise I'll answer them all, but I want to check in. Okay, let's dive. Yeah, so we have, and let me get rid of a couple directories or a couple files that we don't need here. So one of the files that Django creates for us is a file called urls.py. And it's where we put what's called our routes. And these are the URLs that we tell the server to pay attention to. Like here, if I type admin, something should happen. And the reason I knew that is because in this urls.py file, we have this list. And we use this command path. And it says, hey, here's a URL. That's what we call a route. You know, it's exactly like a path to a destination. And the destination is ultimately going to be an HTML page. And here, you can see that there's some other Django code that's being called that's actually generating this HTML. And if I changed this, like if I commented this out, and now it gets a little tricky because I have to, I'm not sure if I have to kill and restart the server, but I am, just to be safe. Let's see here.
In theory, the Django server should restart automatically when necessary, but I've seen a few instances where it didn't restart when I would expect it to.
That is really good to know, though. Thank you. Now, if I try admin, well, we don't get an error, but it's not taking us to the admin page, that's for sure. And that's because I have commented out this route. And if I change this name to something else, just like my awesome admin, and we could even do two of them. We can have two paths. There can be two paths to the same destination, right? And now admin takes us to this login screen. And so does that other route that I created. And that's what we're kind of look at, the basics of routes and paths with Django. And here, yeah, there's frameworks like Django do a lot of work for us, which we can see going on here. Because they've installed. It's probably a whole nother module somewhere called admin. That's a whole like admin system for our website. But I just want to show some basic Django stuff. So I'm actually going to get rid of this, and I'm going to leave that as a reference so I can use it. And I'm going to import something else. Django has an HTTP module for sending HTTP requests and responses. And we're going to write some like very low level code for the basics of, actually, I'm going to leave that stuff there so nothing breaks. We're going to write some very low level code for handling an HTTP request, and we're going to see what that looks like. And for like, you know, building like a real Django project, we wouldn't do all this work in the URLs .py file, but we're going to do it here just so we can see. And essentially, all we're doing is writing a function. And the argument that that function receives is going to be an HTTP request. And we saw some of that last week, how it's just text and we can put things in the body of that. And Django does a lot of work for us because it takes that request when it comes to the server and it wraps all that data up in an object, in an instance of a class. Specifically, like there's an HTTP request class and response class. So it does a lot of work for us. And here, we're really just going to serve up the world's simplest web page. And I think I'm going to do a print statement just so we can see what things look like. So this is just a little bit of extra work. And the most important thing is that we have to return our HTTP response, or else the browser never gets an HTTP response back from the server.
Do you need a closing tag on your H1?
Oh yeah, thank you so much, Justin.
You're welcome.
I mean, you also need a doc type, but we're taking a few shortcuts here.
Yeah, we're taking a lot of shortcuts, which for like a hello world is perfect. It's exactly what you should do when learning something new. We've written this function, and now we're going to use it. And for the moment, I'm going to put it on this route. I'm going to make one up, and then we'll put it on a different route in just a second after that. So let's see here. Now if I go here, and is everyone comfortable with like the terminology path and route or route that I'm using here? Let's see, something went wrong. And let's see what
I think
it
your
is.
indentation's off.
Oh, thank you. See, this is the other thing you do with this stuff is you look in the console for the error messages.
Do you need a colon after path?
I need a comma. Yeah,
Comma. Okay.
thank you. And my indentation's off. Thank you both. Let's try that again. Awesome. So we just created this route and we just said hello world. And then here, this is a big mess, but what's getting printed out is the whole HTTP request object, which doesn't really have any data, but we can see all the attributes on this object instance. Or methods, I suppose. And then here's the response. I'm going to go ahead and create another route. And for websites, really for anything when we're talking about paths, because this is very much like when we talk about the file system, we'll talk about the root directory or the root path. And in your file system, just the / by itself is the root directory. And that's like the first directory of the whole file system. And you'll hear people talk about the root user, and that's like the super admin with access to everything. And we use that term root, or you'll hear base as well, because again, a file path is a tree, and these could form a tree if we want. And we're going to make a route handler for it. And I'm going to make another one right now.
While we're on the subject, I just want to add one little tidbit about just naming conventions in Python and elsewhere. It's very traditional when you talk about routes that like the root route is /. So that's the home page to your website is just /. And then everything after that is, /about or /contact us or whatever, /users, /123 or something like that. For some reason, Django does things differently. And the root route in Django is just empty string. And then every other route after that does not start with a /, but then slashes separate the other parts after it. So you might hear me still talk about, the root route as /, or your first like basic routes is like /about or whatever, even though when you write the routes in Django, you don't start them with a /, but that's just because Django is weird. Commonly, when you're talking about routes, they start with a /.
That is an excellent point, Raphael. And I'm so used to all this stuff that I hadn't even thought about that. And that is a major difference in convention. So I've gone ahead, I've created another method, and I've again forgotten a comma. And I really need to change my editor to make this red squiggly a lot bigger, so I notice it next time. I'm not 100% that there's a URL property on the HTTP request object, but I'm pretty sure there is, because that's how it works in JavaScript and some other languages. And so this is the root route for our page. Yeah, it has no request URL. That's okay, we won't print that. We'll just print a message.
Actually, could we look at the whole request object again? Forget, is it an object or a dictionary?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I'm just so used to JavaScript, I just kind of use the word object.
Okay, I'm not saying you did it wrong. I literally don't remember.
No, I'm with you. And this is actually a really good opportunity to just show folks the docs, because this is your friend, especially when learning Django. And here we can see this request object, which has got to be an HTTP request object, and see all the different attributes on it. It's got a body attribute and a path, and that's what we want, not URL. Let's try request.path.
Yeah, Django, I'd say, has above average documentation, so should definitely learn to like it.
Yeah, I agree. The documentation is great. And there's our friend, the marquee. We can open up DevTools just so we can see what's going on. And then if I go back here, this right here should be the path that was printed. And we can double check that just by adding that and refreshing the page. And when you're starting to work with Django, the console is your friend, and adding console logs like this with this kind of stuff. Let me clear this. Refresh here. Yep, here's our print statement. Here's the path. And then Django's giving us some information too for free. In fact, it logs the time and the HTTP request method, and it prints the path here too. So this is like the heart of Django. Like, it starts to add more. We haven't really looked at project structure and stuff, but this is the core concept that what we can do with our web framework is start a server, define paths or routes, and write functions to handle those HTTP requests and send responses back. And we can do a bit more. Like, there's all sorts of stuff that we can start doing to make our life easier in terms of templates and helper functions and things like that. And just one example of that for the moment is we can use this format argument for our, I was about to say callback function, and that's not the right terminology. And Raphael, I could actually use a little help. What is the right terminology for our request handling functions in Django? I'm used to saying controller or callback.
Yeah, controller is definitely a term. I feel like people don't use that quite as much anymore since everyone isn't so like hyped up about MVC these days. But
Yeah.
route handler is kind of a generic term that I use just for whatever logic is handling that route. But maybe this would be easier to understand actually if you wrote the URL before you wrote the route handler.
Say that again about writing the URL before the route handler. Oh,
Just might make this all make sense more, like what that format variable is for, where it's coming from, where it goes. I think seeing the URL first might
Got
put this
it.
in perspective.
thank you. Yeah, let me add that right now. Thank you, Raphael. That's a really good suggestion. I think I have that right. Yeah, that's exactly, yeah, that will help. And let's, in fact, I'm going to rename that to just be more verbose and explicit.
Yeah, I don't think the dashes are going to work for you there. I don't think those are valid characters in a variable name. So
Yeah.
this is one of the fun parts about being a web developer is that like we have to come up with names for things that work as strings, but also as variables. And like, you know, this name has to work in different contexts, but different contexts have different rules about how you can name things. So like dashes are perfectly legitimate in a URL, but Django is going to use this part of the URL as a Python variable, and dashes are not legal in Python variable names. So we have to use a syntax in our URL that is legal both in a URL and in a Python variable name.
Yeah, totally. There's a lot of moving parts. And here there's a lot of moving parts using this F string. And we're defaulting it to H1, but we don't necessarily have to do that. We could just let the argument come in. And let's go ahead. Let me make sure I have this correct. My route with params. Let's go ahead and look at this, and then we can play with this a little. And then I think we can check in with questions, and it's almost lunchtime. So I have a little bit of an error here. And this is also where a framework like Django is your friend. It's really trying to help us with debugging information, which is great. And this is actually really good because we can walk through this a little, because this tells me a lot. It tells me page not found, 404. That means probably that it looked at this route and it did not find it. And then if I look here, I see, and it says using the URL config defined in schools.urls, which is this variable URL patterns right here, which is like, now that we're using a framework, it expects us to do certain things. And that's why it created this URL patterns list for us. Excuse me. And that's something, you know, we'll always have to do with Django. Django, try these URLs in this order. And I'm seeing this, but it's not here. And I think I know the reason why. Because if I look at this path, it's kind of expecting something here. So let's see what happens if I do that. So this is also really common with debugging, where it turns out you have more than one error or issue to resolve. So issue 1 got fixed. I was not adding the full path. And issue 2 is I have a formatting error somewhere in here. And this may have been me doing the F string wrong.
Yeah, so on line 39, you used the variable format instead of my format param.
Oh yeah, thank you. Rexford, thank you. Yeah, this is gonna make it really verbose, and why you see devs writing shorter variables. I'm going to change this to just be my format, because I think I got confused looking at this, to be honest. I thought format was something Django was giving us. I didn't connect the dots to realize, no, all we're doing is we're saying, let's define a path, but we don't know what's going to be at the end of this path. So we're going to give it a name. It's essentially like a variable. And the variable name is my format. And then we pass in our URL parameter arguments here. And this is a really common pattern, and it's called a URL parameter or param. And I need to fix this here too. And it's one of the core ways we can pass information back and forth. So there we go. And if I did P, it would be a P tag. And another way to do this, I believe, Raphael, if I want more than one parameter, is this the right way to do it? Let's see if that works.
You spelled message inconsistently, but otherwise looks like you got it.
Thank you. So let me fix, oh yeah, that's really inconsistent. Let's put our message here. And this is how you'd see it more commonly used. You know, you're not going to want to set like your H1 or whatever by a URL param, but it's nice. It's a very good visual example.
So I'm
Maybe
kind
that
of
was a little too
confused.
creative.
I'm a little confused because you set my format to an H1, which it looks like you're essentially creating your HTML tag and then
Yeah.
using a variable for whatever message you want that to be. But then I think the correct term is route path. I'm getting them confused. But
No,
your
you're right.
URL thing, it didn't say H1. You could plug in H3, H1P. So it almost is like it's not
Right.
even using your format. So,
Right. So these are default arguments or default.
oh, okay.
Yeah, just like you'd
So you
see
could
with
have done
function.
any HTML tag, but that's just your default value.
Yep. But you're also right that it runs into an issue because the path, like this path, when you have when you set like a URL parameter in your path, just because we don't know what this is going to be doesn't mean we can just not put anything there. Something has to go there. And that's why when I do this, Django says, I can't find this route. It doesn't exist. I see something similar, but it's got to have stuff after it. Does that make sense? Because that's, I think, a critical.
Yeah, it does.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. And I think, in fact, I'm going to get rid of the my format because I think it's a nice bit of visual flair. I think it adds a bit of complication because that's not at all how we would do this. And let's say, like instead of message, let's say username. And I think this will really, we can get rid of this. And if all that works. So here is one way where we're passing information from our browser back to our server, to Django. And the information is just entirely in the URL. And then Django builds our HTTP page. And this is obviously the world's simplest, builds our HTML page. And this is the world's simplest HTML page, but you can start to see how the pieces fit together. And so there's a command line tool called curl. And it will make an HTTP request to whatever URL you want. And then we get back the response. So this is the HTML from google.com. And obviously it's just getting printed to the terminal. So nothing's happening with it. It's just text. But I just wanted to show, like, here's another way to kind of test stuff. I'm not sure where that percentage sign came from, and I wouldn't worry about that. But I just wanted to emphasize the data is all in the URL here. And then Django does the work of grabbing that data from the URL and constructing an HTTP response with information in it, with HTML and our data. And it's like a very simple sort of templating that's going on. And I think this is probably a great point to pause and check in with folks with questions or things like that. Excuse me. And Chris, I saw something about a response status code question, but maybe you could share it and give a little context as to why you're interested.
I was just going off of the notes, and it was just interesting to see what pops up when we do a response code for 418.
Got it. I'm not sure what 418 stands for off the top of my head, actually.
Can we find out?
Yeah, let's Google it.
I mean, just
And I did
set it as a response. Just right in the Django server.
Oh yeah, good call. Thank you. Yeah, let's do it. Let's just do it on the route. Response. Status code.
Yeah, I think you have to set it on the line before.
Thank you. Thank you, Raphael. That totally makes sense. Yeah. Express, a node framework, works like this. Yeah, these patterns that you see are really common. Like it's not exactly the same, but it's similar to how web frameworks work for PHP or Ruby or JavaScript. A lot of core concepts. Yeah, that's a really good call. You just add it on the response. Thank you. So, and this is a great example too of how much we can modify this HTTP response. And let's see what happens. So let's look at this network tab. And let me do a hard page refresh. So two things happen here, which are really interesting. Let me refresh again so we can see the network response. The first is that the HTTP response returned. And because we're also returning this information here, we returned some valid HTML. So our browser went ahead and rendered it. And then we just see here, interesting, I'm a teapot. Okay, so this is one of the joke responses. In the network tab, we can see the interaction between the browser and the server. And we can see here it makes this request to 127.0.0.1 to the root path, and that the server returns a 418 status code error. But that doesn't break the browser, because we also returned some HTML that it can render. And Chrome DevTools is giving us this amazing pop-up here that gives us some information about the response type. So this is someone the internet committee was feeling humorous that day, and they passed the 418 response type. So what we could do is, let's see. No, we can't. Yeah, I'm not going to go there. I was going to try and like maybe add some logic to display something to HTML as well, but it doesn't quite make sense. We could do this actually. Actually, this is a great example. Here in our params route where we have the username. And I need to change this a little bit. So now, if the user's name is teapot, we'll get a 418 response code back. And let's see if this works. So here's hello, Adam. We get a normal 200, everything okay response. And I suppose I'm not doing it. I suppose I should be asking for coffee or something, but, oh, not team. Teapot. And here we get a 418 response. And that's actually a really good example of how our route handler functions can have all sorts of interesting logic that interact with the data the user sends from the web page. And this is a really good point to pause and check in with folks. How are people feeling? What questions do people have? Are there things that would be helpful to go over again? Where's everybody at?
I've got a question. If you can go back to
Yeah.
your VS Code.
Yeah.
So under if you scroll down to where we have the paths, you talked about the, so basically well, I guess my question is, are the paths always going to be absolute, or is there a way to have relative paths?
It's a great question. This is sort of a relative path. I mean, this is a path, and we don't know what this value in this part of the path is going to be.
Okay, but
I'm not sure if that's what you meant by relative path.
no, so like we're always so like you have my awesome route, my route with params. That's all like based off the root path, right? We don't put it here, but with the slash. So it was always going to be like slash and then the rest of the path, or can we, if we're in like, I don't know, or if we're further down a path, can we like refer back to one path
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
before and then down another path from there?
Yeah, I'm like 99% sure you can, because you can do the same thing in other frameworks.
Okay, would it be the same as like in Linux or you know, in the terminal where we use like ... or is there a different way for URLs?
I'm sure there's a different way for Django. It may or may not involve relative paths, and there's going to be a bit more involved with it, because at that point we're looking at like Django also has a concept of sort of organizing things into what it calls apps. So like, you know, because it might not just be the path, you might have a bunch of associated code that all is sort of one similar module or like mini group that we want to be able to work together.
Okay.
You do see that ... notation like in Linux that may pop up.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah,
I have
for
another question about our definitions and or sorry, our functions, the naming. So this is all, well, Django is all within Python, right? So should we still follow the naming conventions using the underscores, or is it different in Django? Because here I see that we're using like camel case.
Yeah,
At the convention.
I got lazy. You're right. So first of all, you're right. Yes, like, you know, Django is written in Python. We're using Python. We should follow Python language conventions. I probably should write this snake case like this. I'd have to check. Sometimes with web frameworks, because of what Raphael was saying, like how we can only name these a certain way, sometimes the naming conventions get different, but I think you're correct that we want to.
Well, because it looks like also that HTTP response is also, you know, in camel case, or actually that's.
Well, that's a class.
Cases. Oh, that's because it's a class. Okay.
Yeah.
I've seen other examples too, but like all the examples I've seen so far use camel case. So I wasn't sure if that's just a convention of Django or not.
That's a great question. Not 100%. They have a coding style doc here, which is great, and it's looks pretty standard Python. And here's an example of a function. I'll share this with folks and we can see here, but I think we want to follow Python conventions until we hear otherwise.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, for sure. Yeah, what else is on folks' minds?
So I'm assuming, like, because it makes sense when you're doing like hello username, but I'm assuming you would use this in conjunction with like already making a website with HTML. Like you're not going to make a whole website with Django, correct?
As part of our Django project, we will write HTML pages or write like HTML template pages that are a mix of HTML and Python. And those files will live within our Django project and be a part of our Django project. And we'll be able to connect them to other bits of code. So we will be like we use HTML and CSS, but those files are going to live in our Django project.
And you actually make them like we were doing it before, that live inside the Django project, correct?
There will be some differences, but same approach.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Can you zoom out for me, Adam? So,
Like so?
yeah, I just want to be able to see more than just,
Yeah. I'm never quite sure which one is right. Please.
And then can you scroll up just a little bit so I can see my things? So sorry to the group for this, but like, I need you to break this down to me like on like 5, because I'm a little lost here, because all I'm seeing is that it seems to me like a super, super complicated way to say, hey, display some HTML on the page. Like,
right.
is what I'm seeing. So I'm not sure if our assignment is going to bring a lot of light, but I could be totally wrong here, but it looks like you're creating a function, which is a request to the Django server, maybe. And you're saying, hey, I want you to write this on the page. And then you're creating a path name that says, this is the path to get to the Django server, which is going to return that response.
Right.
Is that right?
No, you're right. This is all extremely simple
Okay, well,
and
so
limited.
you're saying it's simple, but it sounds like super complicated to say, write hello world on the screen. So why would we do this versus just type out ourselves hello world in an HTML and open it like that?
For sure. The reason is because we are going to do a lot more with this framework than just do hello world.
So is this supposed to be for like, let's say we, instead of doing one page like the Pokemon, if we wanted to have like an entire website to link everything together with those paths?
Yeah, exactly. Like, and I'll show a couple of, I'm just gonna sketch it out in pseudocode, and then I think I'll show like from the docs what a template page looks like. But imagine this user login route here. We've got a username. Well, because this code is now running on our server and is Python, and because Django connects all these pieces together, what we're going to see is, all right, maybe it's not just username, maybe it's also username and password from an HTML form. And I think we might be looking at forms in the exercise. And then let's talk to the database and get that user information. And then instead of, writing this stuff here, let's call another file that's a template file that has like our whole user profile page spec'd out, but now we can drop in the actual data. And then if this is a valid user, let's return all that. And just very quickly, I want to see if I can't find an example of.
By the way, tomorrow, like half of the lecture is going to be about templating in Django. So
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, we're going to dive into this stuff deeper tomorrow. So don't worry if it's a little fuzzy right now.
Yeah, for sure. I was hoping I could just find here's an example. Let's see if I can make this bigger. There we go. So this is pretty big, but this is and folks is everyone looking at it says polls/template/polls.
Yeah.
Awesome. So this is so here's the kind of stuff we can start doing. This is just a fragment of an HTML page. We might even reuse this in places, but you can see that we have this sort of mix of Python and HTML because this is a template file. And so Django knows how to kind of interpret the two. And Django is going to do the work of constructing our web pages for us. And we're going to do the work of telling it, all right, this is what it should look like. I want you to get the data and stick it in there. A lot along the lines of what you were saying, Maya. And so I don't know, I haven't looked at any of this other code, but looking at this, it looks like we're generating a list of questions, right? And I don't know what the question is. I don't know how many questions are in the list, but we create a list item. We even create a link to that question because we have the question ID here, the text of the question, and with a CSS style sheet as well, this will all be nicely styled. And so this template file is something that we might call here, where instead of, this is sort of, again, just sort of a hello world example. Does that help a bit in terms of connecting the dots? And I think like Wikipedia isn't a bad example. Like if we go here and we look at cats, like they're definitely using a web framework here. Like there's going to be a template file just for this sidebar. There's going to be a template file for the article, probably like a generic article template file, you know, so that you just have to write the HTML for this and it kind of gets filled out. And someone has written an HTML template file that's sort of a skeleton of this page, but doesn't have any content. And then possibly somewhere in a database, all this content, the text about the cat, the name, and all this lives there. And the web framework does the work of combining the two. Is that helpful, or was that a little too
No, that's very
abstract?
helpful for me at least. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and it's a really good question. Like we're trying to move really deliberately so that, because I mean, you saw like I got kind of messed up with getting my environment set up properly. There's the virtual environment. As much as we can, we really want to move deliberately and show all the pieces. Because once you start putting these things together, it gets very powerful very fast, like with Bootstrap in a lot of ways, which means that you can do a lot, but also the more you kind of know what's going on under the hood, then the more like you're really in control of what's going on. And also just the better it sets you up for your career and stuff. Yes, that's a really good question, Alicia. Thank you. It's 12:18, so we should stop for lunch soon. Let me check in. Is there anyone have maybe one more question or anything they'd like to review? And then people can throw stuff in chat as well. Okay, let's break for lunch. I'll throw these up in the demo and notes repo. For folks who are interested, I know Zach Fair. Oh yeah, it's deactivate Dalton to exit the virtual environment. For folks who are interested in looking over maybe some local storage stuff from last week, I know Zach Fair had some code he was hoping to share and get some eyes on. So I don't know if we'll do a breakout session for that this afternoon, especially because folks might want to dive into this, but the code is there. And Zach, if you just want to repost the link again in Slack, maybe. And if enough people are interested, you folks should just grab a breakout room and go over it. Yeah, we'll be on Slack. The exercise for today is just really building on this. I believe it comes from the Django site. And indeed, it's called Hello Django. And as you can see, we're going to use a virtual environment. We're going to install Django. We're going to define some routes. And we're going to write some code that each of these routes does in particular. And then we're going to add some URL parameters to those routes, just like I did with that format param, except just a bit more. And this is really the foundation that's going to lay. This is going to lay the foundation for, as Raphael said, when we get into templating and stuff tomorrow, and start just continuing to put pieces together. So yeah, I think that's a great place to stop. And thank you all for being patient and for asking great questions and participating. Have a good lunch, take a break, get off the screen. Raphael, when do you want us to return?
Let's come back at 12:30 and start pair programming this afternoon. I'm sorry, 1:30. An hour from now, hour and 10 minutes.
Cool.
Yeah, quick lunch, guys.
Thank you, folks.